once the starvation gets past a certain point, even if food is reintroduced, you're going to have many, many deaths. I imagine the number will be in the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. Usually you see the early deaths in the most vulnerable, young babies, the elderly, people with pre-existing conditions. Those people will get hit the hardest first. And it will just happen like exponentially, and it'll seem like it's delayed, but it's been happening to their bodies already. It's just that their bodies will compensate up until it can't. And so I suspect that very soon these numbers will start to exponentially rise.
Well, even if it is reintroduced, what does it mean for the people who survive, and their bodies in the future and the kids?
Definitely. There's strong correlation with starvation. And, like in children, they have growth problems and stunted growth. And starvation on any person, once it gets past a certain point, then you get to where you have some end organ damage. And that's when things become irreversible. So exactly like you said, even if the food is reintroduced, once a person reaches a point of end organ damage, even with reintroduction of food, there's going to be some irreversible damage there. And so you're going to have a very young population with permanent damage and permanent effects, chronic things that they'll develop from this starvation that's happening now.
That's Eli Burgos, a nurse practitioner specializing in gerontology and based in Florida, who volunteered with Glia International in Gaza from the beginning of July to the beginning of August 2025. The first thing we talked about was her preparations for what she was about to see and how it actually compared with the situation on the ground.
I had a pretty good idea of the type of destruction I was going to witness. I knew that 80% of the infrastructure and buildings and stuff were going to be demolished, but definitely is impressive when you see it up close. And so whatever I thought I knew just from watching videos and just from keeping up with the events going on, it's just still much worse when you see it in person and you see the direct people being affected, up close and personal. So definitely I was expecting it to be, very, severe and horrific conditions, but it definitely was impressionable, upon seeing it in person.
What is something that people are not fully internalizing about Gaza? Because we all see the videos and the pictures. And like you said, it's much worse in person. What words would you use to try to get the message across?
At least for people in America, I would say our role in it. Because it's one thing to witness something on our screens and just think that's just something happening far away that has nothing to do with us. But the role of our government in it is primary. And so without our tax money, this wouldn't be happening, period. And so I think what I'd like for people to understand is not only the horrific things that are being done to the people in Palestine by the Israeli military and their government, is that the American people have play a hand in it, right? It's our tax money. And so I feel like it's really important to hold their feet to the fire, the politicians who are allowing this to happen, and also the mainstream media who have been highly complicit in whitewashing the Israeli war crimes that we're all seeing on our phones, that have been documented over and over and over again, that have been called out by the ICC, the IGA, Amnesty International, Oxfam, B'Tselem, like all these international organizations. Every single one of them are saying the same thing. And the only one who's saying anything different is the state of Israel, and the mainstream media continues to afford them that leeway on getting, excusing what they're doing. And so I feel like they have a lot of responsibility as well in this. So even though it feels like it's something really far away, it's something that here in America, we have a lot of control and a lot of, we play a big hand in what's happening. So it is our responsibility to make it stop.
You're talking about the Israeli military and the Israeli press saying things differently than, everybody else in the world. And that happened again yesterday with the killing of the civil defense workers and the journalists at Nasser Hospital where you worked. Did you know any of the people that were killed?
Yeah, I had been interviewed briefly with colleagues of Mariam Abu Bakr, and met her briefly. We have been in contact with the journalists, often because they are interviewing a lot of people within the hospitals. And so we do run into them. And also a lot of just my colleagues. The spot that was targeted specifically is just an area where a lot of hospital workers and staff go to take a break in between operating cases or anything like that. And so it's a very popular spot, I guess, for hospital staff. And so many people I knew were just either right there at that moment or had just walked away from that area. And so, yeah, I was very much in touch with what happened yesterday and the people there.
So you were there for 4 weeks total. And what was a typical day like as compared to your work in the States?
To start is just the lack of resources. And so basic supplies, due to the Israeli blockade, there's just such a lack of basic supplies, gloves, gauze, tape to do dressing changes, normal saline, just IV fluids. Antibiotics are limited. We don't hardly have any pain medicine. They're doing major operations with barely any anesthesia. Pretty much every patient in the hospital, for the most part, is a trauma victim. So they're either there with gunshot wounds or explosive injuries, and we don't have any analgesia to give them. So like no pain relief to give them. If they survive the trauma, we can't even comfort them with pain relief. We can't feed them. There's no food in the hospital to feed patients. And so if they survive, they linger and they don't get well because the lack of nutrition just doesn't allow for healing. It doesn't allow for wounds to heal. And it doesn't really allow them to thrive. And so they may survive the initial impact, but we may see them wither away and die from malnutrition or infection. It's the other major complication that we see a lot. Normal things that would be very survivable under a normal healthcare system is just it's not possible in Gaza right now. And it's a combination of the two things, that all the hospitals being directly attacked. So out of all the 36 hospitals, all of them have been directly targeted by the Israeli military. Most of the hospitals are completely non-functioning. And then there's 3 kind of hospitals that are still partially functioning, but even the terminology of saying partially functioning compared to what we see here in the US, it would be absurd for anybody here. We would see it as absurd. Like, this is not even functioning. We would call it a collapse of the healthcare system. So, I say partially functioning just because people are still there. People are still showing up and doing the best they can, but really with bare minimum supplies and equipment. And many people are dying from very survivable injuries. Or conditions that are otherwise easily treatable if you have the equipment available and the system wasn't so overwhelmed the way it is in Gaza right now.
What strikes me too is how people don't give enough credit to both the journalists and the doctors in Gaza. And I've heard so many people like yourself that have been there describe the resourcefulness of the people you work with.
Yeah, amazing people. They're really dedicated to being there for their community. They too are victims of the genocide that's going on. Many of them, most of them, are also displaced or living in tents. They also were, many of them, having trouble finding food. And so we were privileged enough to get 1 meal a day in the hospital, and most of the healthcare workers get 1 meal a day in the hospital. But, let's say when they leave their shift, they're still looking for food for their families. Mm-hmm. And so within all this context, they still come to work, they show up, they do their best. They really, really strive to continue the most quality care possible within the circumstances. They're not trying to cut corners. If something doesn't get done, it's because they've tried and there's just no other way to do it. But if there's a way to make something up or find a different use for an item that can then help with this, then they'll find a way. And so they're really, really dedicated. I mean, that's the biggest word. They will try and do everything they can to help their community. And so really inspiring, but also heartbreaking, because people shouldn't be forced to work under these conditions. And so although the resilience and dedication is phenomenal, It's also just heartbreaking that they're having to put themselves in this situation to keep things going. If it wasn't for the people showing up every day, the healthcare system would be completely collapsed. And so it's only standing because of the dedication of the workers there.
What were the dates that you were there?
I entered the 8th of July and I left on the 5th of August.
So what can you say about your personal observation of the level of malnutrition that you saw?
Yeah, it was heartbreaking. So there's many people, displaced people within the hospital. And so a lot of people in the hallways. As an international worker, when you walk in, the first thing that it kind of was very, impressionable was all the children. So there's a lot of children in the hospital, in and around the hospital, and then they come and they run after you, and you have like this crowd of children running after you, and they have empty plates or empty water jugs, and they're just begging for food and water. So that's like the first thing when you even get out of the car or off the bus, or whatever, however you're getting to the hospital. That's the very first thing that you're being met with. And then noticing the people around, it's very obvious that the population is malnourished. Everybody's very, very skinny. You can see bones poking through. You can see what we call temporal wasting. You start losing muscle mass and subcutaneous fat. The healthcare staff is fatigued. They're very tired. They're sometimes collapsing in the middle of their shift. And this is like an everyday occurrence. Some nurses or doctors would need like IV fluids in the middle of their shift to be able to finish their shift, because they're either so dehydrated or so weak from low energy, from malnutrition. And so it was pretty evident across the board. Even I remember one of my first days there, we were we were trying to resuscitate a child, and maybe 11-year-old or something like that. And one of the nurses doing chest compressions, which you have to do a certain amount of pressure and speed and all those things, they couldn't keep up just from how fatigued they were themselves from malnutrition. And so even just performing something like that, in the healthcare world, we think it's so basic, like doing CPR. That's like, medical stuff 101. It's physically difficult for them to do that because of how fatigued they are as well as healthcare workers. And so you see that deterioration of the healthcare staff, and those are the people that are trying to help the sick, and they themselves are weak and malnourished and fatigued. And so it was the scale of it was what was really impressionable was how many people were so malnourished, so obviously malnourished. You don't have to be like a medical provider to look at the people and understand that they're malnourished. And the other part was the patients who were in the ICUs for weeks laying in the ICU bed with zero nutrition. And every day you go in, and every week that passes by, you're seeing them wither away and get worse and worse, just because they also don't have nutrition. There's no nutrition to go around to feed these patients. And so the starvation was pretty obvious, that it was on a mass scale. And the other part that was notable was despite the situation, the generosity of the people there, and they always were looking out for us and making sure we were okay. And did you eat today? Have you eaten today? Here, have some of this. The generosity of the people, even within what they're going through, always looking out for others and making sure that the other people are okay. That was definitely, will stay with me. As just another reflection of just their humanity and their generosity. And, despite these circumstances, I just think of in America how quickly everybody is to just write off people and just be selfish or only think about themselves and their own problems. And that's definitely not the vibe there. They're a community, and they're looking out for each other.
I've observed that too. I talked to a couple of people there, and every time I do, they're always asking me, how you doing? What's going on in your life? What's happening? Are you doing okay? I'm like, don't worry about me. Is it fair to say that the level of malnutrition is not being reflected in the death toll?
Yeah, definitely. And the thing with starvation is, it's a gradual thing. So our bodies will try to compensate for as much as possible. And so these early deaths that we're already seeing, I think we're already more than 200 deaths related to direct starvation. But usually you see the early deaths in the most vulnerable, which is what we're seeing with the young babies, the elderly, people with pre-existing conditions. Those people will get hit the hardest first. But then what you'll see is the general population, once the starvation gets past a certain point, even if food is reintroduced, you're going to have many, many deaths. And it will just happen like exponentially, and it'll seem like it's delayed, but it's been happening. It's been happening to their bodies already. It's just that their bodies will compensate up until it can't. And so I suspect that very soon these numbers will start to exponentially rise. Even if there's a return of food availability, the number of refeeding syndrome cases, I'm sure, are going to skyrocket, and many of those won't make it to the hospital. And many people won't know to have caution when they start reintroducing food. And there also is not the resources to do the proper monitoring that I do in these situations where we reintroduce foods, especially to children or people who have been severely malnourished. But in this situation, that's everybody. And so the capacity for the proper monitoring and reintroducing of food is just not going to be there. So I imagine the number will be in the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, that people will continue to die from starvation, even if food is reintroduced.
Well, even if it is reintroduced, what does it mean for the people who survive, and their bodies in the future and the kids?
Definitely. There's strong correlation with starvation. And, like in children, they can have growth problems and stunted growth. And starvation on any person, once it gets past a certain point, then you get to where you have some end organ damage. And that's when things become irreversible. So exactly like you said, even if the food is reintroduced, once a person reaches a point of end organ damage, even with reintroduction of food, there's going to be some irreversible damage there. And so you're going to have a very young population with permanent damage and permanent effects, chronic things that they'll develop from this starvation that's happening now.
So is it Guillain-Barré syndrome? Mm-hmm. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, it's something called Guillain-Barré.
Guillain-Barré, okay.
Guillain-Barré. And another term, sometimes you'll hear acute flaccid paralysis. And so this is a situation where your body starts attacking itself and you become paralyzed. And it happens like in an ascending form. So usually it starts at the feet and then it goes up and up. And once it gets to, for instance, the muscles that control your breathing, that's where people can really get into trouble. It requires critical care, ICU care. We're seeing a huge spike in Gaza of Guillain-Barré. Normally, this is something that's a very rare condition. But the reason we're seeing such a huge spike, in addition to the starvation that is putting people's body in a chronic state of weakness, the lack of hygiene, proper hygiene, there's a big amount of gastroenteritis going around. These things can trigger this Guillain-Barré syndrome, like any kind of viral infection, a bacterial infection can then trigger your body into this exaggerated response. And you develop this Guillain-Barré syndrome. And also it can be accounted or attributed to toxicity, like environmental toxicity. So if you think about all the toxins that have been in the air, in the ground, and everything from all the bombing, the air pollution, all these things are toxic. And so all those things also contribute. And the treatment that we have for that normally would be something called IVIG. It's like a special immunoglobulin, medication that gets given, and something called plasmapheresis, which if people are maybe familiar with something like dialysis, it's something similar where they circle your blood through a machine, kind of cleans out the antibodies and tries to, it doesn't reverse or cure Guillain-Barré, but it hopefully will slow down the paralysis or stop it where it's at so it doesn't get worse. And then your body over time will improve, hopefully. But even in perfect conditions, there's the risk of, just cardiac death. There's a risk of clots. There's a risk of infection. There's other risks that come with this, even if you have the proper treatment. But right now, that treatment is almost unavailable in Gaza. I think they've been able to get a few filters into Gaza here and there, but nowhere near enough to what the needs are. And there's also not very many machines. These specialized machines are also not available everywhere. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was one or maybe two machines in Nasser Hospital, and they were not even plasmapheresis machines. They were hemodialysis machines that then were kind of rigged. We talk about the ingenuity of, or like just being so being able
resourceful.
to improvise, resourceful.
Yeah.
They have rigged this hemodialysis machine up in a way that it then does what the plasmapheresis is supposed to do. So, so the access to these life-saving measures are just not available. And the reason they're not available is just because they're not being allowed in. Mm-hmm. Our suitcases get searched. They take things away from the healthcare providers that are trying to come and help. So even with the blockade, any little bit that we then try to bring in as healthcare providers coming in is also very limited and scrutinized on what we bring. Because God forbid we bring something to save a life, it just gets scrutinized and it may just get thrown away and not allowed inside.
Like baby formula or anything.
Mm-hmm. Baby formula, blood pressure medicine, diabetes glucose testing strips. I mean, all kinds of things that get thrown away with no rhyme or reason. It just gets confiscated.
Was there one or two stories in particular that really stuck in your mind?
The children, seeing how young some of these children were with gunshot wounds to the head, and for an army that touts itself as being like super great, and they're supposed to be good at their job, they sure shoot a lot of children in the head. I saw probably off the top more than 10 children with gunshot wounds to the head. I could always look back on my notes and see exactly how many, but there was many children with gunshot wounds to the head and the chest and the abdomen. And so it wasn't like these were stray bullets. I mean, they were chest, abdomen, head, chest, abdomen. Like they were very precise. And we also saw patterns of injuries. The other thing that stuck out, as far as like a story, maybe not of a particular patient, but also the pattern of injuries when they would come from the GHF or the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation at these so-called distribution points. The mass casualties would come in like clockwork every single day. Every single time there was a distribution point, like a time for that. It was like clockwork that these injuries would start coming in. And so the pattern on different days was very notable. Some days you would have a bunch of gunshot wounds to the head. Another day you may have a ton of gunshot wounds to the chest. And so it seemed, it gave the impression that it was almost like they were target practicing, like, or just having like a different, like, hey, today, let's just see how many people, we can shoot in the head, and tomorrow it's chest day. It was just very, and because they're coming in all at the same time, you have like 10, 20 people just lined up on the floor in front of you. And it's just like gunshot wound to the chest. Like it can't be an accident. And so those things were very impressionable. And I'll also note there was a story of a day that just like that, it was a mass casualty event. And that particular day on the floor in front of us, there was about, I would say 6 or 7 children at that moment, all on the floor, maybe between the age of 1-year-old to like 10 or 12. And as the team is triaging, trying to figure out who's the sickest or who needs what, and everybody's working on the children there, little by little, okay, this one needs a CT, you go take that one there, this one, and this 1-year-old baby we were working on had, it was from a blast injury, had an abdominal wound, needed blood. We were trying to get blood, very quickly for this 1-year-old. And in our efforts to try to resuscitate him, he didn't make it. And so by the time we were done working with the baby and he passed away, The other children had kind of been triaged and moved and everything, and he was the only one remaining in that spot for a minute. And so I was waiting to see, okay, what's going to happen next? He passed away. I didn't want to just leave him. He's just laying on the floor. He's not covered. He's just laying there on the hard floor. And so I kind of was waiting a little while to see if anybody was going to come for the baby. And one of the other doctors finally, my colleague, Dr. Tarek, finally came up and said, "Hey, what's going on? Are you doing all right? What do you need?" And I said, "Well, I'm just here with the baby. I'm not sure who's going to come for him or what do we do?" And that's when he said, "Well, no, this baby has no surviving family. There's nobody that's going to come for him." And so normally, because of the situation too, when somebody passes away, it's the family members who pick up the patient and take them to the morgue. They walk them over to the morgue. They carry them over to the morgue themselves. And so in this situation, there was nobody to do that. And so Dr. Tarek and I, we took the baby, we picked the baby up, and I took him in my arms and we walked, out the building, and, it's like 2 buildings over to where the morgue was. And that was a very surreal experience. Obviously, because it's a child, but the fact that it's just so often, it's happening so often, that they have even a new, a medical abbreviation that is really not used anywhere else. But in Gaza, it's WC NF, wounded child, no surviving family, or NSF, wounded child, no surviving family. And so that was a situation where I had to be the one to take the baby to the morgue. We didn't have a full identification on the child because we didn't have his full name, and it's just so sad. There was nobody there to mourn the child, other than us. And so, that will stick with me forever. One of the many stories of children, dying in such a horrific way like this.
Yeah, it's so horrifying because you're probably the 4th doctor I've talked to over the past year or so. Mm-hmm. And the first one I had spoken to was before the letter in the New York Times came out, signed by all the doctors, about the gunshot wounds to the head and the chest of the children. And she had seen it too, and she was reporting it. And then when she saw the letter, she was like, "Oh my God, everybody was seeing it. And you were seeing it too."
Yeah.
And if that is not a testament to what's actually happening there, then I don't know what is,
Yeah. And that's frustrating. That is so frustrating that, one, that the Palestinians themselves are not being believed, even though they're live streaming their own genocide. But that the healthcare workers, the doctors and nurses that risk their lives to go there, who just want to help people, right? We dedicate our lives to helping others, and on any other situation, we are a well-respected profession. People believe normally what doctors and nurses have to say, in situations like this. But for some reason, in this situation, the doctors and nurses have been sounding the alarm for almost 2 years, and nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to listen. They're not, taking these eyewitness accounts into consideration. And just the same way that they're not taking seriously the Palestinian journalists. That people keep saying that there's no journalists on the ground. There's many journalists on the ground in Gaza. They're just Palestinian journalists. And so for whatever reason, Western media doesn't think that they're good enough, or doesn't, value them as in their profession. And so that's another area where I think that the mainstream media is super complicit in this, because they, anytime any eyewitness accounts is discussed on mainstream media, they always have to caveat with, well, Israel says that they didn't do it, or Israel says that they're going to investigate themselves. It's like, well, what serial murder is allowed to investigate itself? Like, how does that make sense? And then how do we take their account as fact when they're the accused, right? So you have to have independent eyewitness accounts and all these things, but they're not taking those into consideration. They are only spewing the same, talking points that Israel wants them to repeat. And so as journalists, they're violating their own code of ethics by doing that, in my opinion. And I think that's a major part of why they're not listening to doctors and nurses who have been sounding the alarm, like you said, for a long time. that, they're disregarding and discrediting people who have been there on the ground and trying to tell us that we're not witnessing what we actually witnessed.
Yeah, there's so many reasons that people aren't believing them. But in your opinion, what should we do about that? What is some of the best practical actions that people can take?
Yeah, I mean, practical actions, thinking of a consistent and long-term plan. I think for the layperson who's maybe never done anything, about this situation or in any kind of sort of speak activism role. But one of the easiest things we can do is boycott, right? And so following the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanctions, and look into the different targeted boycotts that we have going on. Because I think after 2 years of watching children and families and brothers and uncles and cousins and, just being blown to pieces, now being starved to death, that those images alone are obviously not enough to stop what's happening. And so I feel like we no longer should be appealing to their humanity. We need to appeal to their pocketbook. And that's the only way that the American, empire seems to function. It's just, if it's not about the money, they don't care. And so we have to boycott any companies that are, complicit in relationships with Israel. We need to push our elected officials, put their feet to the fire, and demand that they, stop sending weapons. We stop sending money there. We follow international law and American law, right? There's something called Leahy law. There's other things in American law that says that if somebody is being found of plausible genocide, even though we already have plenty of proof that it's happening, but even if it's plausible, we have a legal duty to stop interacting, stop sending weapons, stop having diplomatic relations with a rogue state such as Israel. And so I think the common people here in the U.S., we have to do a better job at kind of demanding that of our elected officials. And then on the other side, we can do our own thing by, being very mindful about where we spend our money, where we're investing our 401k, where we take our vacations, through what companies we use, to book things, or every little thing. You can find a way to just try to make sure that you're being ethical about your purchases. And that's not very satisfying right away. It's not, you don't really feel like you're doing something, but it does work. That was the way that, apartheid South Africa, that was the way that it was, one of the ways that it was achieved, was through a boycott system where the masses, and then eventually on a global scale, people just isolated South Africa until they had no choice. And so that's what we have to do to Israel. We have to condemn them on a worldwide, global scale, and isolate them, and not business as usual until they stop what they're doing. And I think that's really the best way, short from any military intervention, to stop them. For a normal person, I think that that's something very tangible, something very easy that we can do. And it will work, and it does work with consistency. That's the biggest thing.
From what you saw just recently, do you have hope? I mean, how does this end? What do you think? I mean, I know all of this would work, but is it possible?
I have hope because I know that nothing lasts forever, right? So even good or bad, nothing lasts forever. So even though this is already going on 2 years and it's horrific, I do have hope that Israel cannot sustain this forever. And so, and they are losing face on a world scale, at least with common people. More people are becoming aware and more active in their recognition that this is wrong. And so I do have hope that this will end, unfortunately, not as quickly as it needs to. How exactly I see it ending, it would have to be forced. Like, so Israel would have to force their hand. However it ends, it's not going to be. They're not just going to stop just out of the kindness of their heart. So it's going to have to be some sort of pressure, whether that's political pressure with sanctions, whether that's other, like from other countries, many countries pressuring Israel. It will come from some sort of pressure from that way. Like I said, is short of a military intervention. But I am hopeful that it will end. Hopefully, inshallah, sooner than later.
Yeah. Would you go back?
Yes, I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave. I definitely felt a sense of abandonment, like I was abandoning the people of Gaza, and I am just itching to go back. I'm looking at my days and seeing what days I can take off, and hopefully I'll be allowed to enter again and do my part and help in whatever way I can. But I definitely want to go back.
Well, Eli Burgos, thank you so much for your work there and for what you did. And I hope you can go back. Your work is appreciated. It's acknowledged. And thank you for the information you gave us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for having me.